Welcome to The Logic of It All, a conversation on Christianity's search for a reformation with your host, Reverend Gary Essex Sprunger. Hello. Glad you could sit in on the conversation. Sorry for being absent with minor health issues, but glad to be back on the conversation on a weekly schedule. We left off searching for an alternative to the ancient stories about how the will of God was made clear to certain individuals. The stories in the oral tradition told how God appeared directly to the chosen person by an angel or band of angels who made God's command known, or a voice from heaven announcing the will of God. And the stories describe why the will of God needed to be followed and how it was to be carried out. This worked back then for the storyteller and the listener when their reasoning knowledge consisted of myths, legends, superstitions, and mythological gods. But now that we have acquired scientific reasoning, past knowledge does not adequately support credibility for their stories. And since we know the stories were in the oral tradition before words were recorded on clay tablets or scrolls, we are more than aware that the stories were told years, generations in some cases, after past natural catastrophes happened that people back then knew of or had heard about in their folklore. In their time, the ancients believed earthquakes, plagues, famines were all God's punishment for the wickedness in the world resulting from not following the will of God. In our world, we scientifically understand how those natural events happen. We know about tectonic plates and earthquakes, magma and volcanoes, low weather pressure systems, and how tropical storms, hurricanes, cyclones, tornadoes develop. And they certainly are not God dealing out punishment for the wickedness we see. We can be influenced by what they believed. And we know what they believed about mythological gods and attributed vengeful acts to their one God, because that is what they believe gods did to their believers for not following what they demanded. And when people did not obey, they suffered. All that being said, we are now looking to see if individuals who on their own told people what the will of God was. That suggests it could be the prophets, and one well-known one is Moses. There are numerous lists of generations, who was the son of whom, vital information to generations of ancients, as well as today's biblical scholars. The genealogy of the people in the Bible provides credibility for those people being real. For them, their genealogy determined which role those descendants could serve. Example, only Levites could serve in the temple or tabernacle. Descendants of Aaron were to serve as high priests. Now the stage is set for Moses. In Exodus, we only know his father was of the house of Levi, and his mother was a Levite woman. In another book, Numbers, it is only inferred that he is younger than Jacob and Leah, the offspring of Amram and Jochebed. There's no direct reference who Moses is the son of. Living conditions in Moses' lifetime were bad, as some of the Hebrew tribes with herds had wandered for better grazing into Egypt, while others had been taken there as slaves. Evidently, as the stories go, they multiplied greatly to the point where the king of Egypt ordered the killing of all newborn sons of the Hebrews. Remember the story of Moses' mother? In order for him not to be killed by the Pharaoh, put Moses into a papyrus basket hidden in the reeds at the shore of the Nile. For that story, the ancients borrowed a similar story about a baby being rescued from the Euphrates River, who grew up to become a famous Babylonian leader. Moses was rescued from the Nile by the Pharaoh's daughter, identified him as a Hebrew baby. Now Moses' sister, from a distance, had watched what her mother did and stayed to see what would happen. She then went up to the Pharaoh's daughter after she had found Moses and asked her if she wanted a Hebrew woman to nurse him. So she went and got her and Moses' mother to nurse him. And when he was older, she, the Pharaoh's daughter, took Moses back as her son. We don't even know her name, or if Moses was then raised in palace life, or how he came to identify with the captive Hebrews. One story tells us that one day Moses killed an Egyptian he saw beating on a Hebrew. And so, fearing for his life, Moses fled to the neighboring country of Midian, where he was thought to be an Egyptian. There are no records of Moses being in Egypt, or anywhere for that matter. All the scholars have is the oral tradition of several stories about Moses, much like the many stories of Abraham. We need to remember the ancients said Moses was the descendant of Abraham's son Isaac through the third son of Jacob, who was Levi. Thus, Moses was in line to work in the tabernacle or temple. In Midian, he was a shepherd for his father-in-law. Moses had married a Midianite woman. He was tending sheep when he ventured onto holy ground on Mount Horeb. He had not been described as a pious man, or that he had come to this place for religious reasons. And this is where the story of the burning bush takes place. It's called a fraxinella bush, containing flammable oils. But there's no evidence of such a bush ever bursting into flame on its own. The most common example of vegetation bursting into flame from spontaneous combustion is a bale of hay put into storage wet, and the chemical reaction of the mold and heat generated causes the hay to burst into flames. It took many a barn in our grandfather's time to figure that out. But in the ancient story of Moses, out of the burning bush, the voice of God calls him to return to Egypt and free God's persecuted people. Here we have a man who murdered another in Egypt, and the king that had sought to kill Moses has died. Great timing. Another source or story says the men who wanted to kill Moses are dead. Excuse me. Was that the Pharaoh, father of the daughter that had adopted Moses? We don't know. We don't even know if there was a killing, or if it was just an embellishment by some ancient storyteller. But the ancients, not knowing due diligence, has God directing Moses to return to Egypt. A command Moses questioned several times, and each time in the stories, God assures Moses he will tell him what to say to the king, demanding he let God's people go. In fact, another story has his brother Aaron being the spokesman for Moses. And God tells Moses he will tell him what to say, and he will then tell his brother Aaron, because he's a better speaker, what to say to the king. The story doesn't explain how Moses, a Hebrew, can gain a meeting with the king of Egypt. Was Moses raised in the lifestyle of royalty because his adopted mother was the Pharaoh's daughter? And does that matter, now that one story has her father dead, and now Moses is to appear before another king? Or is it the same one? If it is a different king or a different Pharaoh? The ancients used king and Pharaoh interchangeably. All that is missing. But the storyteller arms Moses and Aaron with magic wooden staffs that will get the king's attention. Moses tells Aaron to throw his staff on the ground, and it turns into a snake. Then the king's sorcerers cast their staffs on the ground, turning into snakes. And Aaron's staff, snake, swallows up all their snakes that were staffs. But the Pharaoh's heart was still hardened. So God commands Moses to use his staff to create plagues, a plethora of plagues. The Nile turns to blood, then teeming with frogs, then dust, 2 gnats. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not the Hebrew livestock. Then boils on the Egyptians, even their animals. Some must have survived the previous plague. And then there is hail and thunderstorms beating down the crops and animals and men. And finally the Pharaoh says they had sinned and that the God of Moses had been right. So Moses stops the storm that was all over Egypt except Goshen, where the Hebrews were. But when the Pharaoh saw the storm had been stopped, his heart was hardened again, and he would not let the Hebrew people go. In this story, God tells Moses that he, God, quote, hardened Pharaoh's heart so that you can tell your children and your grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, perform my signs among them so that they will know that I am the Lord, end quote. The next plague is locusts, and again the Lord hardened the Pharaoh's heart. And that brought on another plague, darkness, with the same result, hardened heart. And another plague that kills the firstborn of the Egyptians, even the first male of their animals. Finally, the Pharaoh lets the Hebrews go. And then, with hardened heart again, sends his army to follow after them. The storyteller says there were about 600,000 Hebrew men besides women and children. Moses uses his staff to part the Red Sea, and they crossed over on not still wet from the parted sea, but on dry ground. Then all the king's army, soldiers, horses, and chariots chasing them die when Moses brings the sea back together. Our ancients were marvelous storytellers. In the numerous stories about Moses, he was a guide for his tribes, fugitive, exile, priest, judge, victor, shepherd, miracle worker, man of God, prophet, which the oral tradition says God takes that status of prophet away from Moses and gives it to Aaron because he's a better speaker. Moses is known as the one who made the Israelites one people and the giver of the law, about which there are various versions of the Ten Commandments. One story, God descends to Mount Sinai and calls Moses up to the top to join him. And then God speaks the Ten Commandments to his people and gives them many laws. When finished, God gives Moses 2 tablets of the commandments inscribed by the finger of God. When Moses descends and sees how sinful the people are, he throws the tablets to the ground in anger, smashing them to pieces. That begins in Exodus chapter 19. Another story follows in chapter 34. God tells Moses to make 2 tablets and bring them up the mountain. He's up there with God 40 days and 40 nights, chiseling the commandments on those tablets. And then he comes down with them. Different versions of the 10 Commandments in the stories by our ancients. The oral tradition told in great detail, made it clear. The will of God is revealed to us only by God, and prophets are the mouthpiece of God. According to the storytellers, the presence of God is in pillars of fire, pillars of cloud, a voice in the clouds above, a burning bush, an angel, or a band of angels. Which leads us to the question, who are these storytellers? To their credit, they saw the behavior of people being sinful and used a connection of punishment to catastrophes that people had known of or heard about in their folklore to make the point that this is what happens when God punishes sinful behavior. The ancient storytellers, with their reasoning and knowledge, were seeking to turn people away from acting the way they were. These storytellers of the oral tradition are not just a few, but many different groups of tellers who told stories over centuries. So, who are the storytellers? They're the ones who said the Israelites believed in one God. They're the ones who said the Israelites were God's chosen people. Not only did they put words into the mouths of prophets, those words were attributed to God. The storytellers created the words for God in their stories for generations, centuries. The storytellers are the ones we sought, who on their own told us what the will of God was. That is important as we move on to the New Testament, which has its oral tradition of storytelling. And we will see and hear the same similar techniques being used by the storytellers, our ancients. Our getting together like this is not to challenge the belief of those having a strong faith, but rather to reach out to all those who consider themselves Christians but are not involved in organized religion, to clear up any disbeliefs they may have about some events in the scriptures that's leading to their staying away from worshiping. They're the ones needed to give Christianity and its morality the strength and backbone to stand up against the attacks on the faith we hear about each day. So we move on now to the New Testament, step by step and boldly. I appreciate your coming along next time, which we're out of now. And I know the coffee's cold. Have a good rest of your day and sunshine tomorrow.
You have been in conversation reviewing Judeo-Christian scripture with scientific knowledge to begin the foundation for Christianity's Reformation. Your joining in is appreciated, and you are invited to follow for much, much more of the logic of it all.